Marvel Animation's newest series, Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, just wrapped up its first season, and let me tell ya, this show really surprised me. I was excited going into it, but it surpassed all my expectations to immediately become one of my all-time favorite animated superhero shows. It's truly an amazing, spectacular, sensational, astonishing, ultimate, superior, web of... Okay, well, you know what, that one doesn't really work, but any other positive Spider-Man-themed adjectives absolutely fit this show. It feels like a breath of fresh air in Spidey's storytelling while still staying true to the character in a near-perfect adaptation. The only reason it isn't perfect is that they confirmed Screwball exists in this universe and Peter hasn't beaten her to death yet. And I know, that may seem harsh, but you didn't have to play those missions, man. He should be allowed to break that no-kill rule for this. I can't sleep at night knowing that she's out there in the universe having a good time. It just doesn't sit right with me. For real though, Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man is exactly the kind of Spidey adaptation we needed right now. Not only has it been an embarrassingly long amount of time since we got our last good Spider-Man series, but it feels like a really inspired show that takes big swings with the Spidey mythos that pays off in some really satisfying and surprising ways. Also, considering the fact that Marvel and Sony are currently in a custody battle over Tom Holland's soul, it's just nice to have some new, bold Spider-Man stories. Despite the clear inspiration from 60s Spider-Man, this show is a modern take on the character through and through, and one that feels right at home with the rest of Spidey lore. Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man is a show that is clearly made by Spider-Man fans who only want the best for this character. Their passion bleeds through in almost every scene as they take the wall crawler in exciting new directions. And for a show that was intended to be MCU canon from its initial conception, I am very glad they made the choice to make this a brand new continuity. I honestly love the idea to kind of make this entire series basically one big what-if episode. Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man bravely asks the question, what if Doc Ock was a gamer? And somehow, it works! But the real question that it asks is, what if Peter was mentored by Norman Osborn instead of Tony Stork? Oh, I accidentally wrote Stork in my script, but I'm keeping it. I think it's such an interesting idea to put these arch enemies on the same page from the start. It's a fascinating dynamic to explore in general, but even more interesting against the backdrop of the MCU as Civil War is happening. I think it's a really smart move to keep that same sense of familiarity that the MCU has, and just explore how things could have gone differently for Peter. This series, though, is entirely being developed by Marvel Studios and is basically their way of telling us what they would have done with MCU Spidey had they not shared the rights with Sony. So often I find myself wondering what could have been if the MCU had all the rights from the beginning, so I think this show introducing these characters in this way is a really fun exploration into the alternate possibilities for what this character could have been. And it's not like one is better than the other. For me, this is a holy shit, two cakes kind of scenario, as we get to thrive watching both possibilities play out in real time. And they knock it right out of the park. I can't tell you enough how much I love this show. It has just the right amount of MCU connections to play around with in this expansive sandbox of characters, all while it establishes its own identity, aesthetic, and history in some really fun ways. We get to see alternate relationships between characters like Peter and Doctor Strange, or a really fun Daredevil cameo. Not to get ahead of myself, but I had so much adrenaline running through my veins after hearing that Netflix theme again. I was doing triple backflips in my room at 3 a.m. That was so peak. And looking at this show as a whole, it would have been a very tricky balance for Marvel to make this series part of the MCU, so I'm very glad we avoided that. Imagine if we couldn't get characters like Doc Ock or Scorpion in this show because it didn't line up with the MCU timeline. We really dodged a bullet there because they are some of the strongest parts of the series. And with how they touch on the Sokovia Accords in this, it makes me wonder if future seasons are going to address things like the blip at all. Honestly, it would be insane if they managed to find a way to have an entire season of the show take place during those 5 years where everybody was snapped. There are endless possibilities for how this universe can play around with the MCU lore, so I really hope they take full advantage of that. I just gave him ideas that could be cool right there, so you know, I kind of expect a check on my door by Monday, Kevin. Oh! Also, I'm sorry, but I really love how this show looks. Actually, you know what? No, scratch that. I'm not apologizing for anything. I think this show is animated very well. Special shout out to the intro in particular because I didn't skip it once. That theme goes so hard. Remixing the classic animated intro with a modern twist fits the show's entire mission statement so well, and it's filled with some really striking visuals. We need more long, drawn-out, and stylized openings like this. The skip intro button is there for those who are weak and won't survive the winter anyways. I especially love how they change the title card at the end every time. They're all drawn so well and made even better by the fact that they're usually an homage to iconic Spidey covers. It's another sign that this team is passionate about the character and celebrating his entire history, which I really appreciate. As for the actual art direction itself, I think this show looks genuinely great, and I don't know if it's just me settling into the animation style, or if it got better with each episode, maybe a mix of both, but I am fully sold on the entire look for this series. The comic-inspired art is given depth with the 3D animation and feels like a nice compromise between the two styles. We still get those classic 60s-inspired designs, now just with some 3D animation allows for some really spectacular web swinging swinging and action sequences. On top of all that, the show is edited in such a fun and kinetic way with panels dividing the screen to really make it feel like a comic book come to life in the best possible ways. I understand that it won't be for everyone and it could be an acquired taste for most, but those who get it, get it. If this web swinging scene is any indication, it's proof that they can go all out with this style and something I hope to see more of in the future. Plus, your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man's action scenes are amazing. Also, not a critique because I love it, but god, that title is a mouthful. I cannot keep saying it over and over again, but I fear you just isn't pronounceable, so we do what we can. Wait, what was I talking about? Right, the action scenes. One of the benefits of animation is obviously that you can do the most unrealistic things and it's a visual feast for the eyes. So many colorful in-your-face action scenes that are a treat to watch. You can tell they weren't pulling any punches. The way that Spidey interacts with the environment or how these villains are using their powers is always done in really small but creative ways that enhance every ounce of the action. Especially with both of the Scorpion fights, which are absolutely the highlight of the series for me. A great subversion with the way Peter takes care of him, only for things to take an even darker turn as this sense of dread takes over while Peter is taking maybe the nastiest ass-kicking of his entire career in any adaptation. Like, seriously, look what they did to my man. Beat him within an inch of his life for the love of the game. This is that real, alright? This goes crazy. And then by the finale, when we get this big giant gang war as Peter swings around to try and stop the Scorpion, it's too peak. And also, to nobody's surprise, I adored the Daredevil fight scene. It's on the complete opposite end of the spectrum from the Scorpion fight, as we get to see two evenly matched characters dancing a violent duel in the pale moonlight. It's visually stunning and framed incredibly well. I would have been happy for an entire episode of just these two beating the shit out of each other. And the best part is that Daredevil really just showed up to Aura Farm and leave. That is the most goated thing I've ever seen. Alright, that's enough of me gushing over the technicalities of this show. Let's get to the actual characters now. I'm 1,500 words into this, and I've barely talked about Spider-Man himself. Somebody really needs to rein me in one of these days. I'll probably get more into specific spoilers now, so just be warned and go watch the show instead of this video. It's very well worth your time instead of me just rambling about stuff I like. But to get back on track, I think this version of Peter is fantastic. He's charming in every way the character should be, while also being an annoying yapper, which is so incredibly important. I cannot stress this enough. This man needs to be on every criminal's last nerve as he quips at them until they want him dead. He perfectly embodies everything that Spider-Man should, even in some ways that we haven't seen before. One of my favorite scenes in not just this show, but in any Spider-Man adaptation is when Peter stops a robbery at a pizza place. He returns the money and apprehends the thief, but it's the way he handles the situation that puts the biggest smile on my face. I love that Peter asks the shop owner not to press charges because it shows how sympathetic and understanding he is. As someone who knows the struggles of growing up poor, he's able to see that she made a mistake and how she doesn't deserve her entire life to be thrown away because of it. Nobody was hurt, the money was returned, and she's clearly sorry about it, so he does the right thing and helps them both out. And I think that right there is what a hero is, and the exact kind of thing I want to see Spider-Man doing. Someone who can see past the black and white nature of the law in order to help everyone. He's a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man in every definition of the words, as he looks out for his people and actually gives them the second chances needed to make this city a better place. And considering the fact that this version of Peter is a Captain America fanboy, it just makes sense that he'd be full of empathy. The fact that his suit is red and blue as an homage to Captain America warms my heart so much. As I love the MCU Spider-Man, I can't deny that this kind of inspiration works much better for me, and that's not just because of me being a biased Captain America fan, although he is just like me for real. It's just much more in character for Peter to look up to someone like Captain America. He's the most natural role model for Peter to have, and it's one of the best ways they play around in the MCU Sandbox. It's little details like that which go a long way in adding depth and making these characters feel real. Which is crazy considering the fact that his voice actor couldn't be more different than him. Did Marvel fire their PR team one week? Because it's crazy that they let him say this on the day of release. Looks like Spider-Man fans finally have their own Dean Cain. Hooray. Such a stupid thing to say, especially considering how diverse this show is and how it's so much better off for it. Pairing him up with Norman is such a genius move, not just because of how fascinating it is to see them both develop over the course of the season, but in the way that Norman almost kind of corrupts Peter by the end of it. We watch him grow up through the show as the world beats him down again and again and again, doing his best to get up in spite of this unwavering adversity. But Norman ever so slightly pushing him to let loose and do what needs to be done takes a really interesting toll on Peter. Seeing Peter shed that charm and let his inner rage out is always exciting, but made even better when we see him grasp with these motivations. unable to process the fact that he went to such a dark place, wondering if he can even go on or if this is the right thing to do. It's a natural direction to take this character and gives him a much needed edge that I hope we continue to explore throughout the next season. This holds true for every Spider-Man adaptation, but I would say especially this one considering how happy he is from the start, but there is truly nothing scarier than fighting Spider-Man and then he stops quipping. And this show absolutely gets that. Those moments hit even harder because we see him lock in and let that rage just boil over. One of the coolest things this show does is kind of adapt Spider-Man No More, but put a modern twist on it that sees Peter not give up being Spider-Man, but give up being Oscorp Spider-Man, and I think that's a really fresh and exciting way to adapt this story and do something new with it. It's always interesting when you give a character everything they've ever wanted and see them reject it. And when Peter is working with Norman, he has enough money and resources to keep him being a hero forever with the best technology and state-of-the-art facilities that he could only dream of. So seeing him reject that because he knows this relationship isn't built to last and will only be toxic for him, I think it's such a fantastic way to bring this story into the modern age and have Peter directly rebel against being a corporate puppet as Spider-Man, just doing what Norman wants when Peter knows deep down at his core that's not how he wants to do things. It's an incredibly inspired pitch, and I think is the strongest story they tell throughout this entire show. Peter Parker is far from a corporate bootlicker, and I love to see them exploring that side of the character. But here's the thing. If I have one complaint about this show, it's how they handle his origin. I am a strong believer in the classic Spidey origin staying intact. We can have a few changes here and there, but I don't think you can really improve on perfection. An accidental spider bite changing his life forever and giving him a greater calling is too peak to ignore. So the fact that this show kind of needlessly complicates the origin by turning it into a time loop and adding in this whole destiny element just wasn't for me. I will say though, it's probably done in the best possible way they could as they use it to wrap up the Osborn arc. We get a really satisfying payoff with his character arc throughout the season, and I feel like it was kind of necessary to take it this route, so I understand why they did it. Norman going too far with his experiments as he flies too close to the sun, causing his empire to crash around him is oh so very poetic. It sets up this new chapter in his dynamic with Peter that I think has a lot of potential as they seemingly separate from each other by the end of this season. It was bound to happen eventually, but I like that they're taking their time building up to the Green Goblin and having everything be motivated by small character moments right now. So while I may not love the whole time loop aspect of things, it does work to further the narrative they're setting up and could have huge implications in the future. I'll keep an open mind on it because honestly I've kind of talked myself into liking it more writing this script, but I figured I would just let it known that it's not my favorite thing about the show. But I think it's honestly a strong testament to how good this show is that they can change such a fundamental aspect of the character and he still feels like classic Spider-Man in all the right ways. One of the origin changes that really does work for me though is the fallout from Uncle Ben's death. In this universe, Ben dies before Peter ever becomes Spider-Man, so he never gets the ever so important "with great power there must also come great responsibility" pep talk. It's jarring at first to see a version of Peter who hasn't experienced that, but the long-term effects of Ben's absence are explored in such an interesting way here. While Peter is still a good person at his core, you can clearly tell that he's lost in life without Ben's words of wisdom. Unable to figure out what he's supposed to be and how to be the most effective friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, there's a very clear void in his life for a mentor, and using Norman to fill in that gap is a stroke of brilliance. When he's so desperate for guidance, he'll listen to anyone. Nico even warns him about working for Norman as it seems out of character for him, but Peter is too blinded by his own hope for direction that he goes along with it. And not gonna lie, off the record, I would also completely ignore this walking red flag if it meant getting infinite money, but I guess that's why I'm not Spider-Man and he is. At least until my radioactive spider project comes along well. This is best exemplified when Norman finally gives him the pep talk he needed, but it's wrong, telling Peter that with great power, there must also come great respect. And that line cuts like a dagger. It is a great subversion that really shows how he differs from Ben. That entire conversation kind of shakes Peter to his core as he starts to see Norman without the rose-colored glasses on. I love the idea of Peter starting out with a bad mentor and seeing how he handles that kind of situation. It's a new twist on the classic mythos that not only gives us a really captivating story, but highlights how important the original one is. It takes some special kind of writing to pull that off. And while we're speaking of Norman, I need to sing Coleman Domingo's praises because God, is he such an inspired casting choice? I'm gonna side-eye anyone who hates on him because he brings a lot to this role that nobody else could. For starters, it finally makes sense why Norman has those waves, so that's a game changer. But more importantly, Coleman's take on Norman has him as this suave and sassy businessman that feels like a very fresh direction for this character. What works best for me though is that you honestly feel like this version of Norman is genuinely trying to do the right thing. He has his ulterior motives and secrets along the way with a bit of a twisted sense of morality, but he's only doing these things for the greater good. And that is a really fun approach with this character because it adds a lot to his dynamic with Peter. We know it's an inevitability that the relationship between these two characters is doomed to fail. So starting them both out on the good side, working together, it makes things so much more interesting as you constantly wonder throughout the show, when's the turn gonna happen? And it is incredibly satisfying to see those cracks start to form and some very obviously villainous qualities break through his flawless exterior. Where he really shines for me though is in his interactions with Doc Ock. I love how this show handles their rivalry. Norman putting most of his energy into stopping Otto above all else is perfect. He is a petty man at the end of the day who will not forgive or forget. He's dedicated his life to screwing over his old business partner and catching him so he can get that moral high ground. Norman will not hesitate to get as petty as possible when dealing with Otto. Like, that prison scene was foul. Do you know how much of a hater you have to be to gloat to someone in prison? Dude used a napkin to pick up the phone and everything. He is diabolical. Now with that glider tease, the experiments taking place, and his reputation in the mud, I am very excited to see where they take Norman next season. I hope it doesn't involve the Goblin too much because I want that to be a season 3 plotline at the earliest. But I'm very happy to just let this slow burn play out more and more as we see the obsessive and ruthless nature of his character start to break through. But my favorite character in this entire show is honestly Lonnie Lincoln, which surprised the hell out of me. If you would have told me that Spider-Man wouldn't be my favorite, I would have never believed you and probably gotten you put in a padded cell. But the fact that it's Tombstone of all people is crazy to me. I respect the guy and his indestructible skin, but he's never really quite grabbed me off the pages. Now though, this show has taken a character I barely cared for and made me love him with a bold new reimagining. I don't know how the writers' room came to the decision of making Tombstone young and a tragic friend of Peter, but please give them a raise and put them in charge of Marvel because they are operating on a whole new plane of existence. Even before he becomes Tombstone, Lonnie is a fascinating character operating with his own double life. In school, he's the most popular kid on campus. But once he leaves those doors, he's immediately profiled by racists. It's a very heavy topic I wasn't expecting this show to touch on at all, but one we're much better off for. And honestly, with the double identity, this show has Peter and Lonnie mirror each other in some very interesting ways. The tragedy and relatability of a kid with great expectations who cracks under the pressure and is roped into a lifestyle he doesn't belong in is already sad enough, but it's seeing this new life slowly corrupt him and change his perspective over the course of the season that really hurts. Lonnie was a gifted athlete who could have gone pro. He was a smart and kind kid who made Peter feel welcomed and important from his first day of school onwards. You could ask anyone what they thought of Lonnie and they'd have nothing but nice things to say. So it really stings when he makes a deal to join this life of crime to free his younger brother from it. He sacrifices his perfect future for someone he cares about, and there is nothing more noble than that. And while it may be sad to see him going this way, it isn't all bad. I mean, if you excuse the gang violence and most likely eventual sociopathic tendencies he's going to develop, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. He's no longer burdened by those great expectations as he sheds the weight of his old life for a place he feels welcome. His newfound freedom and peace just so happens to come at the inevitable cost of his humanity one day, and I am not ready for that at all. The day he finally turns on both Peter and Spider-Man, you're never going to hear from me again. Alright, I can't go through with this. You can't hurt him like this, Marvel. It's not fair. When you contrast that with Peter's arc in the series, you can see how they parallel each other in some really interesting ways. Each of them were taken under the wing of someone who could not be more different than the other. On one side is Norman Osborn, a wealthy elite funding Peter's operation to try and help people. On the other is Big Donovan, the leader of the 110th Street Gang and someone who is actively going out of his way to ruin Lonnie's life. And over the course of the season, we see these two friends drift further and further apart as Lonnie is pulled away from the life he should be living to beef with a bald man in a bug costume. Where Peter embraces his great responsibility and runs towards it head on, Lonnie rejects it in favor of this newfound and distorted sense of freedom. You can't really blame the kid when he has this impossible weight on his shoulders, but it's the most compelling parallel to compare their stories as they move in opposite directions. By the end of the season though, it's not like Lonnie is completely a lost cause. He stops Peter from killing Scorpion with a really powerful speech about perception. Lonnie knows what it's like to let people down and disappoint the ones who look up to you. And while he's already made his choice and has to live with those consequences, Spider-Man hasn't. Killing someone in broad daylight would forever tarnish his reputation as a symbol of hope for the city. That right there is a fantastic moment that shows just how well the writers understand both of these characters and feels like the perfect moment to bring their arcs together. The writing of this show is way too good because by the time Lonnie starts in the 110th Street Gang, you feel bad for him as it's painted as this tragedy and something that he's stuck in. But then by the end of the series, when he becomes the leader of the gang, you're almost rooting for him as he gets this big win, completely forgetting the fact that this is a terrible thing that's happening to him just because of how interesting it is to see him happy and thriving for once after this season of suffering. With his skin slowly turning gray, it practically turns him into a ticking time bomb visually for when he's going to go full Tombstone, and for the sake of my sanity, I hope that's a long time away, but everything about his character in this show is so inspired. He is easily the standout of the entire thing for me. And that's no easy task because this entire show is overflowing with well-written characters. I really enjoy this group they've surrounded Peter with. It's filled with people who are right at home in a Spider-Man series like Harry Osborn, along with people you'd never expect in one like Nico Minoru, and they make it work effortlessly. I know some people are afraid of change, so they don't like seeing someone like Nico here, but I honestly hope this trend continues and every new Spider-Man show shakes up the cast with surprising characters. It also means we're one step closer to finally seeing the Runaways again, which is huge for me. I mean, hell, one of his most popular shows involves Firestar and Iceman, a fever dream of a trio that we don't have nearly enough time to get into, but I think it's cool to see them surrounding Peter with new characters. It gives us different dynamics to explore and makes something we've seen 100 times like Peter's high school experience feel brand new. Seeing Peter struggle with his double life as he goes through some of the most stressful situations imaginable is one of the best things about Spider-Man's storytelling. I also love watching Spider-Man because seeing how bad his life is makes me feel better about my own, but it's nice to see an adaptation that cares this much about Peter's identity, like when he changes in the hallway and accidentally reveals himself to Norman's cameras, or he carelessly enters a room and Harry finds out about who he is. It's a lot of fun to play around with and see Peter backed into this corner where now he's forced to work with Harry. And I really like their dynamic, by the way. Portraying Harry as this spoiled rich kid with millions of followers but no real friends is a unique twist that makes sense considering his dad is a damn billionaire. I'm kinda shocked we haven't seen that take on Harry in a more mainstream setting before. And we still get to see Norman neglect him too, so the core of his character is completely intact. This time around, he just doesn't know what a raisin is, which I think is genuinely really funny. And God, when Harry gave Peter the speech about being Spider-Man and helped him make that new costume, I was ready to run through a wall. Insanely hype ending to end an episode on right there. This shot, chef's kiss. That is beautiful. The best example of this identity crisis, though, is with Nico. I really wasn't expecting them to have her learn about it this early, but they proved any doubts I had wrong because it perfectly ties into Peter's journey this season. Also, side note, people get so weird about superhero identity drama and get mad at characters for having a natural reaction to learning their friend was lying to them, so anyone who's hating on Nico for that will start coughing in 4 hours. It's not that Nico is mad that Peter was lying to her, it's the fact that Harry knew and she didn't. It builds off of her fear that Peter was replacing her with Harry, and also the fact that they heavily imply she has trust issues in her past with her parents, so all in all, I think she handles it really well. She did nothing wrong and I would give my life for her. We get to see Nico and Harry form a very natural friendship because of it to round out this new Spidey trio, so I consider that a huge win. It's also cool to see Peter and Nico have a very platonic relationship with no signs of romance at all. We so rarely get to see Peter be friends with women that he isn't trying to date, so I hope they keep it that way. They have such a fun friendship, and I'm very excited to see more of that in the future, especially considering Nico is learning some spells right now. Also, one last thing I wanted to mention was the rogues gallery in this show because, man, they are cooking. It's really refreshing to see a Spidey show highlight characters who haven't seen the spotlight yet. Like, it's crazy that we have an entire episode where the unicorn of all people is the main villain, and even crazier that it works. We get characters like Speed Demon, Tarantula, the Chameleon, this freaky looking symbiote monster who doesn't have a name yet, Scorpion, Doc Ock, and of course, Butane. You know, Butane, we all love Butane. And if you said you loved him, then you're a liar and a fake fan, because he's actually an original creation for the show, considering the actual comic character named Butane is completely different. But from obscure characters to the big names, I really like all of these inclusions. I want to give a special shout out to this version of Doc Ock because I love what they've done with him. It's been far too long since we've seen an adaptation of Otto who was just a petty evil genius that thought he deserved more appreciation for his work. Don't get me wrong, I love the Spider-Man 2 and PS4 Spider-Man versions of this character, but he doesn't always need to be this sympathetic villain with ties to Peter, and I think it's cool to see him as this almost overarching antagonist for the series. I will admit that in the moment I was a little disappointed when Iron Man arrested him because of how abrupt it felt, but seeing how that was the point of it all in the next episode as Norman blindsided him was a great reveal, especially now with the hindsight of knowing that that season was basically his origin and that we've hardly seen the last of Doc Ock. Honestly, there are a surprising amount of characters in this show just waiting to become villains too. Carla Connors is bound to become the Lizard eventually, which I'm really looking forward to given this new take on the character, but also people like Rhino, Bulldozer, and even Leapfrog all sneak their way into this series. If that's anything to go by, next season is about to be insane. The finale wrapped up everyone's stories in a really satisfying way, all while giving us so many crazy cliffhangers setting up the future. From Nico learning magic, to Norman discovering the symbiote, to another Daredevil appearance? Hell yeah! To to a cameo from The Watcher of all people, and then the mind-blowing reveal that Peter's dad is alive? They're going crazy. I'm not usually the biggest fan of Peter's parents being alive, no matter how morbid that may sound, but the fact that he's in prison immediately makes things much more interesting, so I'm really looking forward to seeing what this show does next. They have earned my full trust and attention with this first season, so I just know the next one is going to be a banger. Oh, and to answer the big question I teased in the thumbnail, is this the best Spider-Man show? It's got some tough competition with some of the most iconic Spidey adaptations to date, along with some absolute stinkers that it easily clears. Now, I haven't exactly finished watching Spectacular Spider-Man yet, so I don't think it's fair enough for me to compare it against that, but it's definitely up there. That's kind of a cop-out answer, but I don't know what to tell you. That's the best I've got. If you really want me to, I can say it's the best one, so it's definitive. Okay, it's the best one. There you go. Are you happy? This is the best animated Spider-Man show, but there's an asterisk there because I haven't seen them all. It's the best one I've seen. I'm very glad this show has already been renewed for seasons 2 and 3 because Marvel has struck gold with this series. It's the Spider-Man show we need in right now, and one that takes the character and his supporting cast in new directions that are bound to shake things up in a very exciting way. They've laid some great groundwork here in this first season that they can build off for an even more promising season 2, which says a lot because this first season was already great. Marvel Animation really caught lightning in a bottle twice with this and X-Men 97. They are on a crazy run right now. I mean, if we just pretend that one show didn't happen. But for real though, this show is such a delightful surprise. It's a fresh new take on the Spidey mythos that feels like a love letter to the character. I would happily give this the peak stamp of approval. Honestly, the worst thing about Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man is that it's over because I'm about to be pacing around my room going insane waiting for more. All I ask is that Marvel stop being cowards and let them use Big Wheel. Why would they take this from me? We were on the verge of greatness. We were this close. Put Big Wheel in season 2 where I burned down the studio. Alright, you know what? That's enough of me yapping. Why don't you let me know down below what you thought of your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man? I would genuinely love to hear what everyone has to say and continue the conversation down below. And while you're at it, you may as well give the video a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. If you don't do it, I'm whipping this brick at you the same way Peter did at that kid. He definitely killed that guy, right? I mean, that was brutal. And you're next.